Hi, good morning, everybody. Sunrise in Pineland. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. It's about 6:10 a.m., United States East Coast. The temperature is 55 degrees here in northern Maine. Glad to speak to you all. I'm out driving a little bit early this morning, got some things I got to do. So I'm going to record a little video for you, just coming through some ideas in my mind. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the 16th century, or I should say the 17th century, rather, excuse me. And we're going to do that for a pretty clear reason by the time it's all done. I want you to understand the foundations of a lot of the ideas we're dealing with. So I apologize for the rain making a little bit of noise. I'm going to try to speak a little louder so hopefully you can hear me clearly over that, and that will make for a better program. Just want to thank everyone who's getting Surviving the Fall of America, my newest book on Amazon, as well as the many other books. If you like that, go check out some of the other works. You definitely will enjoy them. Want to thank everyone who's been going and supporting our effort with the Pinelander Pullets. We've now got 4 of our chicks. We are glad to introduce Ellie, our newest member. That'll be one of the little buff Orpingtons. That'll be really cute. It'll work out good having her with that name, I think. But yeah, absolutely awesome. And thank you to the people who gave. You know who you are. Appreciate you very much. And for everyone who supports the program, the Venmo, CVC, PRV, if you give me $20, you get to name one. We got 5 left. So it's going pretty fast. Definitely appreciate the support. Allows the program to do a lot more stuff, and allows me to buy some interesting reading materials, which leads directly to interesting shows for you. Definitely a good thing. As well as we have the mailing set up, P.O. Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine, 04739. Okay, so we're going to start, and I want to talk about the Reformation for a minute. You guys know, and I told you, I was reading a book about Calvin, and I was reading about Jean Calvin and his efforts in Geneva and the Huguenots, or the Huguenots, depending on what we said in French or English. I was reading about the French Protestant movement, and I didn't even realize, really, I should have, but there was a huge French war of religion in the 16th century, and I don't think people really understand what the Reformation was trying to do. So I want to talk about very clearly, because at this point, we sort of think of it historically as that there were hard lines between people who were trying to have a very biblical definition, who were at war with the church, and that is what evolved. It's certainly true, but with the Catholic Church, that's to say the Roman Catholic Church, to be even more specific, because names matter here. But what ended up happening is after Luther, there ended up being an effort to try to get the church to reform itself, hence what was called the Reformation. The goal of the Reformation was not to spawn the new churches of the Lutherans, or the Presbyterians, or the Reformed Church, or any of the other ones that would eventually emerge, the Episcopalians, that's the Anglicans, any of those sort of breakaway. It was to fix the problems whereby it was clear that the Roman Catholic Church was not adhering to biblical scripture, but rather its own traditions as having greater authority. And I'm less interested in getting into the theological fight of it today, although I will say from a biblical perspective, and this will surprise no one, my sympathies with the Reformed theologians. But it's more to talk about how it came about, because it's sort of interesting, and perhaps you may find it relevant to today's story. And we have to go back to Venice, as we often do in these stories. And Venice, in the 16th century, was feeling pretty good about itself. After basically decapping Byzantium in the Fourth Crusade in the 1200s, they had managed to get control of the financial setups, and they were doing really well with it, and they were happy with the system. Although that began to change with the Genovese, their long-time rivals and sometimes allies, were working with the Spanish crown to find access to the New World and to develop those things, whether it be, as well as to Portugal. Because it's important to remember, Portugal actually had a head of the Templars, I think it was, who was the, if I remember right, in Prince Henry the Navigator. They heavily subsidized what they were doing to find their way south around the Cape of Good Hope, which would set the Portuguese missions into India and points eastward like the Spice Islands, as well as through the Spanish missions, which led to Brazil, to the Caribbean, and other points like that. All right. So what happens is Venice was kind of in a rough spot, but Venice still had overwhelming sway as Italy was coming out of the Cinquecento, the 1500s. So in the 1500s, what happens is the Pope appoints this guy Contarini. What's his name? I'm trying to remember his first name. I'm going to say it's not Giuseppe. I'll get it later. Anyways, Contarini was appointed even though he was a secular diplomat, he was appointed a cardinal. Now, whether you feel good about that theologically or not depends probably on whether or not you're Catholic. But the interesting thing is he was brought in with a reform mindset, theoretically. And the guy is famous for writing a history of Venice about its republic and why its institutions endure. And of course, the root of Venetian endurance was their financial system. It was ledger-based banking, right, that basically runs the world today. And eventually they realized that Venice, the bankers realized Venice wasn't a big enough operation. So what would happen is, as the Reformation would come into being, and this is a totally different story than what I'm trying to tell today, what you would see is you'd see revolts in the Netherlands from holdings of Charles V, who was Emperor of Austria, threat to Venice, to the Lady of Cambrai, who was the King of Spain, threat to Venice through opening up new trade routes, and who was the head of the Netherlands, threat to Venice, theoretically, just by being part of that larger thing. And so what they did was through the Reformation, what happens is eventually you see the revolt of the Netherlands, and the Netherlands become the Dutch people, or eventually where the bankers get in there, and the Dutch East India Company is formed, which ends up being one of the richest entities in human history, and was the model also for the British East India Company. And it's no accident that eventually you see a Dutch king, William of Orange, be set up for the current, that would be set up between him and the House of Hanover. You'd see German kings that were basically Venetian royal families working their way onto the English throne, displacing the Tudors and the Stuarts in order. All that leave aside, then we'd be talking about Montagu and the start of the English Bank, which I've talked about a little bit, but we'll go back to Contarini for a minute. Contarini was friends with Luther in talking up how they were going to reform the church, but at the same time, he was also friends with Ignatius Loyola, who some of you will recognize was the original founder, a Spanish man, of the Jesuit order, which has been well understood for having many different roles in history. For the Catholics, they see them as the order of basically lawyer priests. For the rest of the world, we see them as conspiracy theories who cause a whole lot of problems for the rest of us. Okay, so leave that aside for one moment. So we're in Venice with this guy Contarini, who's the cardinal, who was a secularist, who basically is supporting both sides and talking about why Venice endures and how its institutions are actually greater than the actual city-state itself. And what ends up happening over the fullness of time is that we see out of this epoch come this split within the church. And the split within the church is interesting because even though I totally theologically agree with the Reformed theology and the corruption of the Catholic Church was manifest, what it also did was it began the process that would culminate at the end of the 30 Years' War, where the bankers were made rich by all the mercenaries they funded by all the various kings. Sound familiar? Where they separated church from state, and they took away power from the church to regulate the areas of ecclesiastical law. So what did ecclesiastical law do? Ecclesiastical law was designed to work on families, to punish things like divorce and adultery. It was designed to make sure children were educated. It stood against things that were considered biblical sins, like usury. And all of this goes away because the bankers fund a hardcore right-wing, how should I say, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but a hardcore right-wing version of Christianity, which, by the way, I actually think was correct. I mean, that's sort of the unique thing of this. But ultimately, what it led to was this idea that all these functions would either be handled by the state, and the state would have total supremacy over the law, and church might do things, but it would be under the supremacy of the state. And what did states need to survive? Well, states had a monopoly on violence, so there were no longer mercenaries, so people couldn't fight back, but states had to pay their troops, and states didn't have control over money. They had to borrow money to pay for their troops, and they had to keep getting into wars over these things, so who ended up getting rich and powerful? Well, you know the story, it's the bankers. And so, if you go back far enough, one could make the argument, and some have, that the biggest reason the Reformation survived was because the Venetians wanted to help stir up some problems in the Holy Roman Emperor against the people who were threatening their financial monopoly, and seeing the Reformation arise. And now the Reformation reformers, to their credit, like many reformers, were well-intentioned, and that's often the case. Movements happen with people who have very big, very good ideas, but the problem that ends up happening is the ones that are selected often serve other interests. Like, for instance, you can make the argument, and actually the evidence bears this out, that women's suffrage was heavily funded by the Rockefellers as a scam to basically eliminate ethanol, or I should say, basically corn oils or potato oils, and get everyone using gasoline by making sure the infrastructure was built that way. It wasn't that they wanted people to stop drinking, and it wasn't that they expected people to do it, but they wanted to make it illegitimate for a couple seasons After all, we put it in the Constitution and took it out so that way that fuel, alcohol, could not be used as the primary means for pushing locomotion in individually, privately owned vehicles. And while it's certainly true that gasoline burns cleaner, is more well refined, it would also have been true back then that most farms would have had a very easy time producing the fuel they needed for their simple vehicles, and we might have had a totally different economy. But the Rockefellers weren't going to let that opportunity pass, so what did they do is they pushed the temperance movement along with women's suffrage and all these distractions whereby people missed the boat. Same thing, one could argue, happened with the Reformation, where you took some people who were well-intentioned and said to them, hey, we want to fix the church. And I support this, by the way, as a Christian. I totally support it. And I think that we need to take that hard line. We need to say what is biblically true, what is pleasing to God. But at the same time, understand that the schism that was put in there, and money went the other direction, literally to Loyola, the Counter-Reformation, right? The Jesuit order, the Inquisition, was being funded by the same damn people that were funding the Inquisition and Reformation. At the end of the day, were being funded by some of the same damn people. And that's the point I want to make to you, that they keep playing this game of us versus them, us versus them. And I think if you look at it in the longer term, and I think maybe this is why Bacon called his project New Atlantis. They understood, perhaps, the Atlantean undercurrents to the Phoenicians. Remember, Phoenicians, sounds like Phoenicians, right? Came through Rome and Carthage, through Phoenicia. Phoenicia's Tyre. Where's Tyre? Canaan. Who are Canaan? The Canaanites are the people that literally God warned Moses, if you leave these people, warned Joshua, you leave these people here, they're going to cause nothing but trouble for you. And what has the story of first for the Jews, but for Christians been the fight with bankers of usurious interest, how it has tempted us away from God, how it's tempted us away from the world. This has been a very long story. So some of them, perhaps trying to resist them, or perhaps as affection to them, we can't really know, it's complicated, escaped to the New World, and that's why Bacon and his think tank called the thing the New Atlantis. And why you see that ultimately there was a contest of some sort, and whatever ended up happening, eventually the Dutch faction gave way to the British faction to America, but yet you look at NATO and it's all the same old actors playing the same old song, and those are the people who are still making decisions about the way the world works today. But how do you fight them? And this is what you have to understand, that you can't win the fight until you decide how you're going to fight against the idea of money and how it runs your life. And once you understand that money is a tool that's being made out of thin air to be weaponized against you, you can identify your enemies. You can identify this universal ecumenicism that's out there that takes you away from God, which is the core of it. That frankly you've seen the Catholic Church succumb to many years before, and that the Protestant movement, which once had such vitality, has in many ways done the same. You see this in the corporate personhood that was an invention of these same people, started in Venice, developed through the Dutch and the English, where they are these theoretical, imaginary golems we give power to, corporations, who have rights we don't and punishments that can't be inflicted upon them. You see this in the giant governments and the big conglomerates they support, and what you realize is you have to break away from all of these things, go smaller and go more local, and set truth at your things. And if you really think of what it is, what you're fighting these days, you are fighting anti-corporate, you are fighting anti-globalist, and you're fighting against this idea of an ecumenical truth that pulls all people together, that is separate from what the Bible teaches. And if you don't understand that what they've stolen from you is they've basically given you a certificate of exchange for you giving up truth. This was the original idolatry and paganism. Like if you really study, like Joseph Farrell and others have, the history of money, what you find is it was a trick that temple priests did, where they gave slips and certificates in exchange for the gold and silver people worshipped because they were shiny, and we've always had this strange allure to them, and it's been understood. So if you want to remove yourself from this equation and begin the actual fight back and the liberation of your own humanity, you have to find these things. You have to understand the lies that have been put over your face that are in many cases hundreds of years old, where people don't even begin to understand the deeper roots. I try to share them with you because I think you'll find it interesting. I'm trying to pull this straight here. The road's a little bumpy. All right. I hate shoulder harnesses. Let me tighten this up 1 second here. Okay, that's a little better. Anyway, if you begin to understand those things, what you begin to discover as well is that you have to define your own truths. And this is one of the things, as Pinelanders, we talk about. Where is the actual truth? And I have to tell you, there cannot be any institutions that are sacred cows. we have to recognize the corporations that push the wokeism are against us, but they're the same ones who go with this universal ecumenicism of God is love and all religions need to get along and there needs to be one truth for that we all accept. This global homogenization of truths into a namby-pamby pulp is not going to feed you the word you need to survive. It's only going to empower the system that offers you tricks and temptations, but offers no chance for truth. And so people say, well, what is truth? Truth is the search. Truth is looking in the Word and asking for help. It's a lifetime of service where you won't have every answer and you have the wisdom to recognize you don't know that. But what it isn't is the idea of celebrating the world as it is and thinking our nature and indulging it is all there is in this life. Whereas we do that so we feel like we're good about ourselves, and then we can't question the money that's used to control us, the corporations that shape us, the governments that constrain us. And if you begin to understand how long these conflicts have been going on and how dark and dastardly it has been that the whole society in the West has been constructed to enable a very few people to control very many through basically a simple sleight of hand magic trick, which literally, if you go to Venice, you would see it's beads moving on a board and it's slips of paper moving in place of things that are actually real. And now it's just numbers and digits, but the trick is no different than when it was used for fiat through arbitrage. Or even if you go back to gold and silver, which as much as people like to have and as much as we might trade with one another, we have to admit, you can't eat gold and you can't eat silver. So what are we going to do? Well, my answer, such as it is we have to begin calling out these actors, and there cannot be any sacred cows. And I say this because I'm going to be saying in the future, I'm going to call out corporations, I'm going to call out political parties, and I'm going to call out all the denominations that are being terrible. I'm going to call out the New Apostolic Reformation and all the evangelical churches that promise you're going to live our best life now. I'm going to call out the Catholic Church for its foolish process, whereby it says, hey, give us money and you can buy indulgences, just like you could in the time of Luther, or the idea that confession before man equals confession before God. And it's not because I don't understand the theologies of these things. I've read my Aquinas, I've read Augustine, I've read the Church Fathers. You go back, Origen, Tertullian, all of them, Ignatius. We need to get to truth. And the truth, in my mind, at least this is what I believe, and this is what I think we got to fight for, is just cling to Jesus as closely as we can, search the Word for the truth, and understand how all these institutions were built to take away from us choices we have by saying, well, these are just the things we have to accept. Science is a religion as much as any of these other ones are, and we need to understand its limitations. As a process for understanding our world, I have no problem with it. As an all-encompassing explanation for all things, it has its limitations, which must be understood and which must be resisted. And so I share all that with you as a thought this morning as I'm driving around, because I want you to know that these are the battles we're going to have to fight, and what we are going to have to build within ourselves an awareness of these things, share information with one another, and begin changing how we look at the world. The answer is not going to happen in a single geography, as much as I wish it would. It's not going to happen in a single person group. It's going to happen in the awakening of persons who find it within their heart to be led by the Lord and to see through the many deceptions and delusions. I can tell you some of the ones that existed in history, but as much as I've studied and as much as I've learned and as much as this community knows and has shared, we can only guess at what sort of tricks can be played on us in the days ahead. And the only thing we really can be sure of is that deception will continue, because that's the story from the beginning of history. So if we want to be wise and not be fooled by deceptions, follow the words of Christ, be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. So we have to understand all these tricks, but we also have to lead our people away from this thing. We need to lead them out of spiritual Babylon and to reconnect with the Lord. And this is the battle that's at the heart of this. And why do I put God at the center of it? Because we don't know truth. We will fight over what truths we're allowed to discuss unless we assert from the very beginning there is a greater truth and we will serve Him. And that's what it has to be. And if people aren't able to take that leap, I understand. It's fine. But ultimately, you're going to be there or the world is going to claim you. And, ultimately, life itself is a death sentence, so we might as well play for something bigger, don't you think? People used to understand that once. We lived in a world where everything wasn't anesthetized and kept safe from us. We didn't live in a world where there was a system for everything, a law to regulate everything, and dollars for everything. We didn't live in a world where religion solved all of our problems and expiation was as simple as talking to another man. We lived in a world where God needed man. And man was intended to live in a world where God had relationships with us. So if you want to live in a world that makes sense again, we got to reconnect with God. But to reconnect with God, we have to know ourselves. And to know ourselves, we have to undo what Orwell did. We don't know our future because we don't know our past. On this channel, sometimes we talk about the past, and it's difficult and it's complicated, and a lot of times you see good people being used for bad purposes, and there's not much we can do to stop that at this point. But you know what we can do? Make sure we're not those people in the story. Speak the truth, cling to one another, ask God to look out for each of us, and God bless each and every one of you. So I'm Tom Kaczynski for Pinelander, for Sunrise in Pineland. I am going to be gone. What was I going to say? Just reminders of Venmo, CVC, PRV, P.O. Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine, 04739. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Maybe I'll do a show tomorrow, or later today, rather, but I got a lot I got to do. Hopefully this gave you something to think about while I was driving around here. Now I got to get back to work. All right, God bless. You guys have a good one.